Hi, and welcome to the Informing Choices mini-pod. As we have seen across the globe, the COVID-19 pandemic has morphed from a health crisis to an economic crisis to a social crisis and increasingly a political crisis. And as society attempts to come to terms with changing how we live our lives during the pandemic, attention begins to focus on the desirability of returning to normal compared to the advantage or the horrendous prospect, depending on one's point of view, of transitioning to a new normal. The question to pose is, what might new normal look like? We're going to look at one aspect of this very broad question. So to talk about the future post-pandemic home, I'm delighted to welcome US-based futurists Alexandra Whittington and Sylvia Gallusser to the podcast. Alex and Sylvia, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a little bit about your focus and your backgrounds. Alex, why don't you go first?
Hi, Steve. Thank you. Happy to go first, and I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you again. My name is Alexandra Whittington. I go by Alex, and like Steve said, I'm a US-based futurist. I'm out of Houston, Texas, where I teach part-time at the University of Houston and also work through my consultancy Partners in Foresight as a futurist interested in what I call strategic social foresight. So that just means I look at education, gender roles, family, household, consumers, and all those sorts of social issues from the lens of a futurist.
Thank you. And Sylvia?
Hi, Steve. Thank you for having me today. And I'm so happy to join Alexandra on this. So yeah, my name is Sylvia. I'm based in San Francisco, California. I am a futurist, meaning I am a strategic foresight consultant on one end, and I love to write future fiction on the other. I am the founder of an initiative called Silicon Humanism. We are dedicated to the possibilities, but also the impact of technology on our human and social future. And I am also a board member, really happy, newly board member at Grace One Guild. This is a sense-making organization created 10 months ago in the aftermath of the pandemic, and now counting close to 1,000 members, and where I have the pleasure to work with amazing individuals such as Alexandra.
That sounds very exciting. So let's get into this, and let's have this conversation about the post-pandemic home. And I know you guys are working on a really exciting project. So tell us a little bit about that project. How did the project come about?
So first of all, the home seemed to be a key element, probably something personal, but a key element of what was changing during the pandemic. The home became a place of work, education, and with increased hygiene constraints. So layers upon layers added in one place. And this inspired me a metaphor, a Tetris game metaphor with a space constraint, time is accelerating, and we need to constantly reorganize blocks, furniture, spaces, and kids and pets and work tasks on top of more traditional chores. So it was very personal experimentation at first that got me into the project. But while exploring this, and I think that the same for Alexandra, we came across signals of hidden violence, more mental health issues, physical violence towards kids, abuse towards women, loneliness of the elderly, students being distressed and now protesting. So to share one statistic that really got me frightened, Save the Children revealed that 500,000 additional underage girls risk being forced into child marriage, and many of them will become pregnant just as a result of school closure and education interruption. So that's why, along with 6 other contributors from the group at Grace One Guild, we decided to engage into this topic of the home as a real field to conduct anthropological work.
Wow, makes me think a little bit of some of the things that we were talking about just before we came on air. And it's the difference between the haves and the have-nots, about how easy and straightforward or otherwise it is to cope with some of the implications of things like lockdown as we try to work our way through the pandemic.
Exactly. Alexandra has written actually three beautiful stories. Maybe we can mention them because she really tried to put them into context, so we don't talk just about our personal experience, but also about voices from others.
Yeah, tell us about the stories, Alex, about the scenarios.
Sure, happy Happy to jump in. Yeah, I could talk about the scenarios, but I also just want to make that observation on what you were saying, Steve. You know, that
Mhm.
social divergence that we're seeing between the haves and the have-nots. I mean, in my area locally, there's something like 40% of the students are failing classes in the public schools. And it's just sort of like, well, that, what can we do? People really don't know what to do about it. It's just sort of the way it is. And I think that those sorts of quiet tensions that are going on beneath the radar. Another example in that area was a bunch of children, or students, I should say, that quote unquote went missing after lockdown. The schools didn't hear back from a lot of the students who were sent home to learn in the US, that is. They just sort of lost track of a bunch of them. And it's a funding issue on a practical level, but it's also a social issue. Deeper down, it's about home instability and the fact that a lot of our essential workers, just really can't parent and homeschool. So there's a lot going on, underneath all the layers of mental health problems and the physical health of coronavirus epidemic and all of that, that we weren't really seeing them rise to the surface yet. So I think we tried to emphasize those in the scenarios. And I talked about that in a homeschooling scenario, just as a little preview. I talked about how a future, they're set in 2030. So this is 10 years from now, a child who grows up to basically pioneer the homeschooling movement for all economic classes, and form an organization, that kind of grows to challenge, say, like, here in the US, we have these, teaching programs that sort of get people into the education field. So it grows into a huge project like that. So that's just one potential. I tried to put a positive spin on it, but that's just sort of one potential to come out of the fact that we have a whole generation in mass experiencing the homeschooling education process.
If we can just back up one, what are you seeking to achieve through the project? What are the objectives?
Well, Grace Wengin is a global league of sense makers. Their goal, and the goal we had in that project, is first of all to look to generate ideas collectively and support rebuilding a better human experience. And in that specific case, we didn't just want to produce a report that nobody would ever read, because there are so many reports today online, but we also wanted to adopt a creative approach, like with multimedia material, future fiction, as just mentioned, and crowdsourced artifacts. And we had 3 objectives with this. First, to provoke thoughts, emotions, and empathy. Second, to raise awareness also towards current but also future challenges. And finally, at some point, be able to provide resources as well. So the outputs, and I hope you can see it live very soon, it will be a landing page representing a home, with each of the rooms linking to a short content related to the room function. You will have poetry reading, fiction, text, essay, audio file, set of pictures, video, charts, and so on.
Fascinating. So we're seeing the pandemic being a real catalyst for change. So what are the things that, through the work you've already done, that you're starting to notice about the nature of change, and what are your assumptions about the direction of travel that takes us in?
That's a really good question. I like that, Steve. Just if I could respond, and I want to hear what Sylvia has to say about this, for sure. Coming from as someone who studied the social sciences, and I think, again, this is something Sylvia and I have in common, sociological or anthropological background and interests, and also we both like to write fiction stories. And so those sort of melded in this project. You'll see it's sort of a mix of analytical and creative work. There's different levels of interpretation going on. And I think what we are learning is how the home is such a microcosm of society. So I think as a futurist, what we're learning is, and this is something I already believed in, but it's just reinforcing my belief that the family, the household, the home is a really cool indicator of the direction things are going. So when you see things like in-home exercise equipment just going nuts, there have already been predictions that the gym isn't coming back. The home gym is the way of the future. So, I see that, for example, as something specific, changing the actual home itself.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe in addition to that, and really following what Alexandra is saying, my focus was really on mental health. We used to believe like home is a safe harbor, and suddenly there's all these mental health issues that are increased at home. So I really wanted also to focus on the mental health issue, and I connected with a wonderful team of professionals in that field. And with one of them, Paul Cross, a psychologist, we worked on designing hotline scenarios, like a mental health hotline, pandemic home hotline. People would call and get some advice, some help, and some resources. So that was something that was really interesting. And I believe that in the future, the mental health issue at home, because work also is at home, is going to be a big challenge. So yeah, the focus was really on this for me.
So that I'm also imagining that if we roll forward, and perhaps we're already seeing it very significantly now, but the nature of social inequality is actually being highlighted by the need for many of us to stay at home. Are you seeing the mental health issue also being broken down in terms of frequency there where it's an issue, along the similar lines of other social inequalities?
So the question is around the connection between or the correlation between social inequalities and mental health, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Alexandra was mentioning education, and definitely there's a big connection between lack of or students dropping out of school, or students not having also a lunch program from school anymore, and not having healthy food at home. So definitely the fact that a lot of students or kids were back at home where they could have been in a social environment, it has been more difficult in some social category where there was not money enough to have good food, or the parents had just an essential work and they needed to go to work and couldn't take care of children. So we see children that really are at home alone all day to do their online learning, and parents are not able to get any babysitting or any adults to be there with the kids because they need just to go to work. So definitely that's a big strain on the kids. And we think that for the future, it's going to be long-term consequences of this.
And I would just add to that then that you can break it down into the different layers of social inequality, because being on lockdown in your large home with a big, backyard and outdoor access is a really different story from where, one bedroom apartment with 9 people and 1 bathroom or whatever, all trying to stay safe. In fact, there was some tweet at the beginning of the pandemic, someone had just retweeted it, kind of like a viral tweet around the different categories, like high income is at their vacation home for the pandemic, whereas middle class is in their suburban home, lower class is in a small home, poor and working class is in an apartment. So it really does, it's all happening in the home right now. There's a lot of reverberations, I would say. So that, I think that's an important part of understanding the mental health challenge. It's everyone from a 1-bedroom apartment to a large home with a backyard.
So one of the things that I think you've been talking about are archetypes of homes. So take us through what you mean by archetypes of homes, and how do you characterize those?
Definitely. So one main aspect of the project was definitely to talk about the physical space and about what happens in the physical space, and about the links between the change in the space and the change in the life we will have at home. So we worked on identifying new trends in architecture, real estate, home design, home interior, furniture, equipment, and so on. And we came up with 4 archetypes of home that I can name for you. So first, the healthy homes. Really, the ideal home will offer a repurposed entrance. We leave our shoes at the entrance. There's a sink. There's a utility cupboard. Everything you've been seeing during this pandemic will kind of be there probably for a while. But also in terms of surfaces, of paint, you will have bacteria-resistant paint. You will have cleanable surfaces, more air filtration system, touchless faucets. So that's about the healthy homes. Then you would have more of a fluid homes, like the modularity of the home will be key. More broken plans, you can reorganize the plans with different separations, less underutilized spaces, open plan areas to foster community living. So you see the link between the space and the way we live, the schedule of the people within the home. And similar to we workspace, we talk about a we live space, reinvented all day long. Parents occupy the space to work during workday, then kids join for schoolwork times, and family members come together to socialize in the evening. And we have two other archetypes I can mention quickly. The sustainable bunker homes, really being closed from the exterior, defensiveness, urban farming, solar panels, battery charging stations at home, because the home will become a danger-proof self from the chaotic and threatening outside world. But at the same time, it contributes in sustainability, we hope so. And finally, the compliant homes, because the compliance we need at work is now brought to the home. So the regulation will apply to our home furniture, and you will have ergonomic kitchen chairs to be able to work all day long, humidifiers, ambient technology to stimulate social interaction and preserve mental health. And I love this idea of a hotline that could be installed, so that's the elderly, the fragile, the lonely can be cared from a distance when they're at home.
It feels like when we start to look at some of these home archetypes that there are two big themes actually that leap out at me. One is the implementation of rapidly emerging technologies, and some of those technologies, I guess, are evolving more rapidly as a result of the pandemic, and certainly their implementation. But the other is the wider issue of sustainability, because if we think about the kind of UN sustainable goals and some of the critical issues there, we see all of those things being factored through the pandemic, whether it's the impact on drivers of climate change reducing because we're not traveling very far, to the social goals as well. So sustainability feels like it's a really strong theme through what you've just described, Sylvia.
Yes, right. I think that's the driver. And that's always the question with the pandemic. Like, are we changing things, or are we accelerating changes that were there before? And definitely sustainability and smart homes were there before. But it seems like now we have a catalyst, like another reason to really implement it. And I think smart homes, at some point, it was seen as a nice feature or a fun way to live your life. And now it seems like it's mandatory to have this type of compliant homes. And for people alone for a long time, you need to have definitely connected homes.
Fascinating. And Alex, I just want to go back onto the scenarios that you mentioned and that you've written. What are the critical differences, do you think, that you've articulated through the scenarios that really differentiate 2030 from 2020 as a result of the pandemic?
I think that it just represents the emergence of many different forms of what we would call family. That is the way that people live together. So I think that, that's one common thread that runs through this experience, at least in my mind, that in the future, we're going to organize ourselves slightly differently, perhaps based on the experiences of this particular historic experience.
Yeah.
So things like, co-housing and living nomadically somewhat are different ideas that I sort of put into the stories. Just kind of exploring, like, what would it be like? How would that change society if people moved around seasonally, for example, which is one of the scenarios with older folks kind of moving around the country in pods so that they could not have to stay based in one spot, but actually be able to move, but you have to move in a group, right? So I guess it's just about breaking down the various assumptions. And I feel like the pandemic is such a fertile time for doing that. It has broken down so many of our already existing assumptions. I feel that audiences are probably open to more. So that's sort of the direction I went with those.
And one of the things that also strikes me is some of the features of those scenarios are technology enabled. And I'm completely aware that your focus is on a lot of the social issues that will be important as the world moves forward through the pandemic. But just to bring it back to something that I'm always quite interested in anyway, what are some of the critical technologies do you think that would be in place to help some of these future scenarios come to life? What are the enabling technologies that allow us to live some of those more socially acceptable lives in the future?
Well, to give you one example, I talked already about the homeschooling movement. So the scenario sort of talks about how what started under lockdown in 2020 grows by 2030 to like a real full-on homeschooling movement that basically, like in the US, for example, would compete with the public school system, right? And I think for that to happen, we need to address some of those inequalities that we've touched on already, economic inequalities, and doing that maybe through 5G connectivity, through better infrastructure throughout our rural areas, for example, and of course the other new forms of getting Wi-Fi or getting moving information around. There's really cool cutting edge stuff going on with Wi-Fi through light that's transmitted through light. Don't ask me to explain how that works, but apparently it does. I did read that Google recently canceled their Project Loon, or I guess Alphabet. It was the programs that they had going to transmit Wi-Fi or internet connectivity from hot air balloons, and so they've pulled the project. But I'm sure there's other things like that in the pipeline. Different ways of connecting remote areas or whatever it may be. That could certainly encourage the homeschooling movement that I envisioned in that scenario.
Fascinating, thank you. Sylvia, how will people know when the project is coming to fruition and be able to read and see all this content that you're developing? Where will people need to go to pick that up?
So definitely we will advertise it on LinkedIn. So please feel free to connect to us, Grace One Guild, or individually to Alexandra or myself. One thing I can mention is, as part of the project, we are building a museum of pandemic home artifacts. And it's not just something we've produced ourselves. We also reach out to all of you if you want to send us your pictures of the pandemic, like everyday objects that gained place in your homes during the pandemic. It would be wonderful. We have already a good collection of them, but it's a collective work. So we have really the intent to reflect on what has changed in the home through these objects. And we already see a few things. We see a change, of course, in everyday behaviors, the way we eat, the way we dress, and so on, but also a lot of creativity. We were like really impressed by the creativity. And also the fact that after all, despite everything we say about technology, about being online, there's a lot of physical objects we really stick to. We love concrete materials, concrete stuff. So that's fascinating. Take a look at it. It will be online on Grace One Guild's page in a couple of days.
Well, Alex and Sylvia, that's been absolutely wonderful. It sounds like a fascinating project. In actual fact, it sounds like a really important project as society comes to terms with, I don't really like the term, but a new normal, something different, a transition perhaps into what seems like a grand idea of a better world in the future. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much, Steve and Alexandra.
Thanks, Steve. It was great being here. Great chatting with you, Sylvia.